Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken, executive editor with the Mises Institute. And with me today is Joseph Solis-Mullen. Joseph is an educator. He teaches political science. He teaches economics to some extent. Well, Joseph, where are you teaching right now? And kind of just tell us a little bit about where you're teaching. And then once we find out a little bit about his background, we're gonna talk about today's topic, which is The Struggle for Liberty, which is a new book by Ralph Raico. And it is a series of lectures, and it was not in written form. And I decided that we needed to turn it into a book. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But Joseph, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and why you're interested in Raico and this topic, and we'll kind of move on from there.
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate you having me on. It's always such a pleasure to chat with you. So I am in the history department at Spring Arbor University here in Michigan. It's a small Christian liberal arts college. I teach primarily history classes, but I have graduate degrees also in economics and in political science. And so when there's a 100 or 200 level class that someone else doesn't want to teach, I usually get it. So I wind up teaching a lot of different classes. So my interest in Raico, one of the classes that I teach is Western Political Thought, and that's a 300 level class in the political science department. And so one thing that I was so thrilled when you took on this project to turn it into a book, because I would love to basically turn the class into a history of liberalism class, and to bring in attendant things like communism, socialism, nationalism, to talk about those in the context of the evolution of liberalism. But there was no adequate textbook, and as a college educator, I can't really assign a series of lectures, which is, as you said, these are transcribed lectures that were given at the Institute many years ago. But they're such terrific lectures, and now I have an actual book. And so now I just need to convince the department to let me redesign the course in that way.
Well, that's exactly why the book now exists, is because it's heavily footnoted, and it can be used by scholars in a way that a lecture could not be used, right? So it's fantastic. So it's great to hear that you're using it to teach in classes, because that's what I was hoping to go for, right? Because you can't just say, hey, listen to these lectures, and because nobody gets what the sources are, right? You then have to look up everything yourself. So what I did here is I provided sources and background, where his all quotations are, because he doesn't, right? He didn't provide footnotes with the lectures when he delivered them 20 years ago. And so now it has all of that, so people can quote page numbers, and they can look up the sources, and they can follow all of the arguments like back to their sources that he's using. And so we don't have nearly enough time to cover all of the topics that he covers here. And you can see right from the cover, if you're in the video version, right? I used an image from the French Revolution because of it. When we're talking about, now I had some people complain, they're like, that implies that you think the French Revolution is good. I'm like, no, it doesn't. It shows that the French Revolution is important, and it's certainly central to the overall analysis here, because this is a history of political thought, right? And obviously, you can't ignore the French Revolution there. But one of the topics that we're not going to be able to talk about today, for example, is how much Raico hated Rousseau, right? Just hated him. Hated his guts. And in fact, he starts out his Rousseau section talking about how, well, we all know how the ad hominem fallacy, right, is a bad thing. And just because you're a jerk, that doesn't invalidate your arguments. But we don't want to go overboard. And then he goes into a section about what a horrible, disgusting human being Rousseau was. Before moving on to some of his arguments. So there's a lot of that stuff in this book. And it does cover, right, ideas of enlightenment, which Ralph was skeptical about. It looks at the 18th century, but it goes back even further than that. It goes back really to the 16th century and even to the Middle Ages in terms of political structures and understanding their influence on modern-day politics and our very ideas of liberty and freedom. They go back much further than the 18th century than some people seem to think. But there are three more specific topics that I want to talk about today. And I think before we go on, just so people aren't confused, I think the first thing we have to talk about in terms of Raico's use of language is how he uses the terms liberalism, classical liberalism, libertarianism. And I think if we address that, then people will be less confused when we talk in this discussion today. So I don't know how you use the terms, Joseph, but I certainly was influenced. Well, before I read this book, I was influenced by Raico. Now, Raico, of course, was a historian, taught for 40 years at SUNY Buffalo. Was a friend of Murray Rothbard, and certainly a very careful and he was a working historian, right, who kept up with the research. He kept up with the new information that was being done with historians, and he did the daily work of being a historian. And of course, your use of terms, your categorization of political movements and stuff matters. And what influenced me here in the use of the term liberal was Ralph's understanding of the terms liberal and libertarian and classical liberal as a part of this movement that really started in, say, we might say the 17th century. And this has been totally messed up by Americans, right? Americans more so than others. The term has been messed up in a variety of ways. But in the Anglosphere, it's become really bad. And the people who consider themselves the free market party, the people who are in favor of laissez-faire, that sort of thing, they've completely abandoned the term in many cases. They let the left have it, right? Raico explains how the left went out of its way to steal the term liberal because it was a very popular term. Liberalism was super popular in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so all these social democrats, all these democratic socialists stole the term and started applying it to their thinking. And then all the people who actually were real liberals, they're like, oh, I guess they have it now. And you still see they do this all the time. As soon as the left starts using a term, the right just completely abandons the term. Oh, the left uses that term now. The people will be confused. So we have to find a new term. And they keep coming up with new terms. The left just gets to do whatever they want. The left gets to seize whatever language they want, and then the right gives up immediately and grants it to it. And that's kind of what has happened with liberalism. But the way Ralph used it is classical liberal. Imagine a Venn diagram. Classical liberal is all these movements that were united by the idea that society can basically run itself and doesn't require a state to regulate and guide society. Now, within that group, so that's our big circle in the Venn diagram, and within that group, there are groups of more or less radical disposition, right? There are the very hardcore radicals. That's like, say, a lot of these French liberals like Gustave de Molinari, or say you might say even the levelers of the 17th century, maybe. Rothbard considers them the first real libertarian movement. So we're talking the 1650s, 1640s here. You've got your more milquetoast liberals. I mean, maybe you could include like Alexander Hamilton in there. He's not even really a very good liberal, but certainly like William Gladstone, the prime minister of Britain, one of them in the 19th century. Kind of a moderate liberal, certainly not a radical liberal, like say Richard Cobden or John Bright, and like say Charles Comte, not to be confused with Auguste Comte, which something Raico notes. And then, so he says, basically, your radical classical liberals are the same thing as today's libertarians. The libertarians had to come up with a new term because the left stole liberal, and then all these Americans got real confused. And so Rothbard is really Rothbard who decided that this is the term we should use. And he actually stole a term from the left. It was Marxists who called themselves libertarians. But Raico says, yeah, there's a clear connection. There's not like, oh, well, if you're a libertarian, you're a radical anarcho-capitalist, and you have no connection to these 18th century classical liberals. What he's saying is that the larger group is classical liberals, and then within that, which is anyone in the 19th or early 20th century, if you use the term liberal, they would have known exactly what you were talking about. You would have been talking about pretty radical free market people. And so that diverged into some other terms, but he uses that term interchangeably with libertarian, and he just generally uses it anywhere within this book, because this is the way Ralph uses it. He means it just to mean, he means liberal. He means, yeah, if you have to use classical liberal to distinguish the older type, the traditional type, the more historical type, that's okay. But when he uses liberal, he means the free market group. He uses other terms to describe what like people who listen to too much talk radio call liberal. They're social democrats. They're democratic socialists. That's it. In Europe, that's the term, social democrat. It means somebody like Kamala Harris. It means someone like Hillary Clinton. Everybody knows what it means. But for some reason, Americans decided to assign the word liberal to those people. And then it's caused a lot of confusion. I mean, Joseph, do you encounter this in your class? Like, how do you teach this when kind of you cover this topic?
Yes, it's a term of incredible confusion. And so what I usually do is I start by saying, let's imagine liberalism as running along a train track. Apropos, right? 19th century trains. And it starts to diverge around the 1830s. And what you get is classical liberalism, that is unreformed orthodox liberalism, and progressive liberalism. Now, people like John Stuart Mill seized upon the name of liberalism because liberalism was associated, and by this I mean classical liberalism, there was only one liberalism, it was associated with progress, with human betterment, with the proper enlightened way to run a society, that this is how societies became rich and strong and better off. And so it was simply co-opted. It was seized upon. And then the definition of what it meant was slowly, over many decades, transmuted into something that by the turn of the century was completely unrecognizable. And so that's essentially what happened. And so I generally explain it like that. I tend to use, I like Raico's definition, which is that civil society, by and large, runs itself within the bounds of the principle of private property. So I think his definition of classical liberalism is excellent. That there is not to be any interference in the economic or social lives of the individual by the state. And it's John Stuart Mill who starts that perversion. And it's very clear, and I teach social contract theories in that class, and I always bring in Rousseau. And I put Rousseau and Locke right next to each other, and I say, they're going to tell you in most classes that these are just social contract theory. They're the same, basically the same thing. Two flavors of the same thing. They couldn't be more different. And let's chart the evolution of liberal thought over the course of the 19th century and see which set of thoughts wins out. And it's very clear that the Rousseau, that the Mill, that theirs are the ideas that win out. And in part, it's because it is amenable to other collectivist ideologies like nationalism, which rulers during the 19th centuries were seeking to harness. You mentioned the French Revolution and the cover on the book. There's been no more important event in terms of determining the future course of world history, probably, than the French Revolution, because it is what destroyed old Europe. Europe was the one who was on its way to mastering the world. It introduced the idea of the nation state, which then proliferated around the world. Like, we are living in the world the French Revolution made. I think it's telling that Zhou Enlai, when he's talking to Nixon, they're just kind of, bantering about this and that. And Nixon says, hey, what do you think of the French Revolution? And Zhou Enlai says, too early to tell. Too early to tell. So it's a critical
That's a true strategic thinker right there.
Yeah. So I think Ralph Raico's definition of classical liberalism is excellent. So, of course, within that circle, as you said, you can have libertarians, minarchists, anarchists, you can have all those different things, but certainly excluded from that circle is anything like a social democrat. Anything like what we call in the United States, well, Republicans. Republicans are certainly excluded from this. They would love for the state to intervene in the economy. In the social lives of citizens. Democrats and Republicans in the United States simply argue about how much or in what way, with what ideological perspective. And this is something John Stuart Mill would have entirely agreed with. He was a terribly censorious individual. Well,
let's talk about John Stuart Mill, right? One of the benefits of this book is that it will, I think, introduce you to a nice a broad perspective of who were the important liberals in 18th and 19th century and even into the early 20th century. Who are the people who were fighting the good fight? A lot of these names are now forgotten. Why? Not because they weren't influential. That's the thing, is a lot of the people whose names you won't even recognize were actually extremely influential and color your views to this day through more recent thinkers. The thing is, they're never taught in schools, right? Because who cares, right? Much more important to learn about various Marxists and other agents of the state than the people who are fighting the fight for free markets. But if you want to actually know, you want a good list of the good guys of history, this book will provide you with a lot of names you probably didn't know about and help you understand how their thinking filters down to us today and has done a lot of good in really preventing something far worse from happening. I mean, just imagine the world without someone like Ludwig von Mises in it, and just how much better the Marxists would have done for themselves without that. Because a lot of people say, oh, we haven't won yet, just give up, because the world isn't totally hardcore libertarian. I'm like, if you're wondering what good the libertarians have done, just you could be thankful that we don't live in a copy of the Soviet Union, because that's what we would be living in if it weren't for these liberals of the 19th and early 20th centuries. But on to John Stuart Mill, who distorted the whole thing, like you say, right? I think chapter 2 in this book is just called straight up, no, it's chapter 3, just called straight up John Stuart Mill, because Mill is such a problem. And I used to teach political science, and of course I went through a graduate program in political science too, and I can tell you, and you probably have encountered this too, a near universal thing that is said among political science faculty, a few of whom are, of course, libertarians or free market people, is that John Stuart Mill represents the typical thinking of classical liberalism in the 19th century. And that if you were to compile a list of the most important liberals from that period, you've got like Locke and maybe Adam Smith, right? And then John Stuart Mill, right? This guy represents all the thinking of classical liberalism in the 19th century. Raico shows that's not true at all, right? Raico goes into all of these other highly powerful, influential, like members of parliament, people who are churning out journals, people who are influential on the continent, especially outside the Anglophone countries. John Stuart Mill was not regarded as particularly important. He's regarded as important today by people on the left because John Stuart Mill set the stage for what we now call left-wing varieties of liberalism. And Raico goes into how a lot of this even goes back to Mill's like personal problems, right? Like Mill was an adulterer and he hated conventional society, and he hated that society, if left to its own devices, would, through social pressure, enforce certain social mores and morality and that sort of stuff, not involving the state at all. But Mill invented this idea that freedom requires the abandonment of any sort of social pressure or requirements that people abide by any sort of moral rules without even any sort of coercion. That was the thing. The other liberals recognized that freedom means not being coerced by the state. John Stuart Mill invented this idea that freedom means not having to just basically follow just general conventions of society whatsoever. And of course, you can choose to not follow those things, but you pay a price. Mill was obsessed with that idea, and so redefined liberalism as this just do whatever you want thing, and the left loves that in modern liberalism.
And it's so obvious if you've read Rousseau that Mill is an inheritor of Rousseau. Rousseau literally abandons his children, gives them up for adoption. And when he's asked why, he says, well, because I can't give them all the things that society thinks they should have. And so I'm going to let society give them what society thinks they have. Society made me do it. Right. I mean, it's incredible. And then John Stuart Mill is the exact same way. And as you say, he makes no distinction between state coercion and the social pressure that comes from living in a community. It's absolutely incredible that, as you say, when you sit down in your introduction to Western political thought class or something like that, they're going to present it, generally speaking, as, there was Locke, and then there was Mill, and by the time you get to the 20th century, if you've been able to follow it as an undergraduate, your head is spinning. How on earth did we get to this point? And it's very clear that we need to look there in the first decades of the 19th century, which is why I think this book is so helpful, because he shows that the arguments that were being had, especially on the continent, there were much more influential French and German liberals. The problem is that the Anglophone scholars couldn't read these continental languages, and so they just kind of got forgotten. And that's
a point, of course, Ralph makes in numerous places, right? Is that in America, we're kind of biased by the fact that Americans can't read other languages. So it's the assumption that the English-speaking and English-writing liberals were more important than all the others. But notes that a lot of our knowledge of economics comes from Italian economists, for example. Yeah. That in the late 19th century, the Italian free market economists were among the best in the world. And a lot of that does come down to us now, but most people don't know that because they don't read any of the original Italian economists because it's in another language and that's too hard. And so people just generally ignore that stuff. But yeah, all of those issues have helped contribute to this idea that Mill is super important. So I would certainly recommend looking into that. And Ralph, you bring up Rousseau, right? Ralph says, look, if only Mill had been a Frenchman, maybe lived on the continent, and would have just been able to come to terms with the fact that he was an adulterer, because Frenchmen were okay. They could deal with that. That was just something they did, and they didn't have to rewrite all the rules of society to accommodate their adultery. They just, this is a flaw I have. This is something I do, and I wish I lived in a world where I didn't have to have a mistress or whatever garbage people tell themselves, right? But it was far more acceptable for a Frenchman to say that than Mill, who was heavily influenced by all sort of these moralistic thinking of his father and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So Ralph suggests sort of a kind of a psychological motivation behind this bizarre departure from what all the liberals were saying at the time, but it really created something that the left can love today. Now, moving away from Mill, and this is something that Mill never understood, and this is, I think, the third topic we'll just talk about, mm-hmm. is this idea of exploitation theory, liberal exploitation theory, which Mill doesn't really have anything to say on that. But a lot of the best liberals, when we look at, say, especially the French theorists, we're looking at the guys who are who were writing, say, for the leading French liberal journal at the time, in the mid 19th century, Le Censure Européenne. So you got Charles Comte, you got Charles Dunoyer. Comte was Jean-Baptiste Say's son-in-law, and it was that world in which Gustave de Molinari, radical, arguably the world's first anarcho-capitalist, came into his own with that sort of thinking. But then Vilfredo Pareto, right? If you've studied economics, you know the name Pareto, like in Pareto Optimal. But Pareto, his economics are so-so, but his political thinking is razor sharp in understanding exploitation. Now, I wanted to bring this up just to address an issue, I guess, because I've been trying to track it down, but I've been told by reliable sources that James Lindsay is obsessed with this issue. He keeps criticizing modern-day libertarians or classical liberals for suggesting that there is class conflict in the world, and that this class conflict is in many ways orchestrated by state actors, which is really at the heart and soul of liberal ideology from the 19th century. I guess in James Lindsay's mind, I don't know, you can look this up, but he has defined this, the idea of that there's conflict between different groups of people, he calls that like right wokeism, or the woke right, this idea that there are different groups in society that are in conflict with each other. Now, he says, just Marxists think that way. Now, this is complete nonsense, BS. This is something that Ralph shows in his book, right? It was actually the liberals who invented the idea of class conflict. It was the liberals who looked out there and they saw, look, we have people who are just trying to live their lives, who are engaging in voluntary exchange, minding their own business. The wealth they build is through free exchange. They don't hold a gun to anybody's head. But they're all being exploited by the tax-eating classes. There are the tax-eating classes and the tax-paying classes. And this is an endless struggle between the two groups in the world where states exist. Because what you have is the state, and it has its friends, and they tax you, they regulate you, they exploit you, they extract wealth from you, and then they distribute it to their friends. That's the tax-eating class. That includes, of course, not just people who work for the government or people in the government. It's your engineering friend who builds weapons for Lockheed Martin or something, right? It's a tax-eating class. Those people would have to go into something else if they weren't receiving all of this money from the Defense Department. People who build roads, even, we regard them as private sector, but they're not. They're the tax-eating class. And then, of course, any other sort of special interest group, like people who lobby for increases in Social Security payments, people, of course, who want more Medicaid, all that stuff. These are the tax-eating classes, and there is a conflict there. There's a class conflict that exists. And Raico goes into the details of that. He even notes that in early Marx, a lot of what Marx was saying was actually very good, in the sense that Marx was identifying how there was this conflict between the state and everybody else. And then Marx goes in a wrong direction. But it's very important to recognize that this is some of the most hard-hitting and most I would say trenchant critique that we get from the liberals is this idea of this conflict between classes. And he notes that this is used in America as well. He points to William Leggett, a great American op-ed writer and an editor, who he wrote a column that is noted in the book called The Street of the Palaces. And this is an article. It's just a representative article that covers sort of this idea of liberal exploitation. And he looks at the banker class. A slogan that Leggett used was the separation of bank and state, because he recognized how the banker class was exploiting people. And that, again, back to the tax-eating versus the tax-paying class. And so this, I think, is a very enlightening topic here as well. And in Europe, you got Pareto, you got Comte and Dunoyer, who also recognized this very meaningful and dangerous way of exploitation that the state engages in. And it's impossible really to, I think, understand the true fullness of liberal thought, our history of political thought, without understanding this idea as well. Otherwise, you just kind of end up with this idea of, I guess everybody can just vote together, and that's how we can work out of all of our differences, and the state will act as the arbiter and make everything work. No, liberalism, because of its class warfare theory, essentially recognizes that the state is not in a position to lessen conflict. The state actually, by its very nature, creates this conflict. And that's a very important observation. Nevertheless, I just continue to hear this idea that class warfare is bad, class conflict. Only Marxists think that way, but that's just clearly not the historical reality.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think it does actually tie in rather well with John Stuart Mill, because, of course, John Stuart Mill had great antipathy towards the market. Why? Well, I think in part it's because he was a sinecured individual. He was a bureaucrat. He was a government employee. He didn't have to earn his living by the market, by its vicissitudes. And also, it gives you a biased perspective on how society and the economy work and should work. He worked for the British East India Company, which was essentially doing social experimentation. They were very heavily influenced. Some of the earliest experiments in progressive social engineering were conducted in India. And it's interesting that they wound up blowing up during the Indian Mutiny later in the century, and that's when the British government came in, asserted control, and said, actually, we're just going to try and keep everything just as naturally as it was, and we're going to rule through these princes and not try and do social engineering here, because it's obviously causing all sorts of disruptions. But so Mill fits perfectly in that. He was a parasite. He was not a productive member of society. He was someone who did not earn his living through the market. He earned it through the extracted income of others. And he used his position to try and manage the affairs of individuals against their will. So I think it all fits perfectly there in terms of Mill and what an awful guy he was. So yes, liberal class conflict theory. This is something that has been recognized in all sorts of great literature. Of course, Rothbard wrote a lot of great stuff on the class conflict theory in terms of there is a productive class of people, and then there is a class of people who only can extract. The government produces nothing. It can't engage in voluntary exchange by its very nature. And so yes, this is something that needs to be repeatedly emphasized over and over, is that yes, there are classes who are in conflict, and it is the state and it's clients, and then there is you. And of course, Leggett, who you mentioned, he was one of the Northern Jacksonians. And the banking issue, that was the hot topic. And of course, people like the inheritors of the Hamiltonian tradition, they wanted to use the federal government to conduct improvements within the country. But this was all money that went to connected political cronies, and just like with the bank and the Cantillon effect of money and how it gets distributed through the economy. So the Jacksonians were reacting against that. And he was one of the most influential Northern Democrats in the 1830s as an op-ed writer, I believe in New York. He's writing for a New York paper. So, yes, it's been recognized, and it took a lot of state education to get people to stop seeing what was very obvious to any ordinary person. The Jacksonian movement was a movement of the people. It was not a movement of the intellectuals. The reason, and Rothbard, I believe, had written a piece about why intellectuals hate the market. It's because they would rather have a guaranteed income. And the state is what affords intellectuals that guaranteed income. The state is a massive employer. And even public universities, people don't necessarily think of those as being the government, but it is. It is the government who's paying them this money. So, of course, they naturally disdain working people, entrepreneurs. Of course they disdain these people. They don't spend any time around them. They've never had to engage in any of these activities. They're completely disconnected from what it means to generate actual wealth. They're parasites. And so that's it, the liberal theory of class conflict, which, as you pointed out, Marx did in his early writings write a fair bit about that. And I haven't read Marx in a few years, but I remember in some of his historical stuff, I think is a lot better than his theoretical stuff. Like his writing on like the Second French Republic, the fall of the Second French Republic. I have a book over there somewhere, The Failed Brumaire. But he understood that there is a parasitic class. He tended to associate it. He got it kind of mixed up with his theoretical stuff, which kind of took it over, where he associated the state with the haute bourgeoisie and all these different things. And so, but no, he was on the right track initially with the state. And of course, the goal of communism was the eventual disappearance of the state, and that it was going to be, all worker democracy at the local level and all this stuff. So, but certainly, the idea of the managed state by these technocratic experts, which is of course what we wound up having, which was something that de Tocqueville had warned about, the eventual emergence of soft despotism, which Ralph Raico has another terrific little book on Tocqueville, where he talks about this. It could be seen coming, because liberty is a precious thing, and not very many people actually care to take responsibility for their lives. I guess it's better to just have this general socialized scheme where you can buck pass and all of these things and free ride, and that's pretty much how we got where we are today. But part of it too is education. We have to win the fight for the minds of the people. Raico talks about the history of the Industrial Revolution. That needs to be taught in the proper way. And if you look, why was it taught the way that it was? Well, it was based on these Blue Book Commission reports that had been put out by Parliament that everyone just kind of mindlessly cited. But who was sitting in Parliament? It was the wealthy landowners who hated the new upstart business people. So, of course, it was just full of anti-business propaganda. But it took, how long did it take? Like 100 years for anyone to go back and look and say, actually, I don't think that was true. And then Hayek wound up writing, golly, it was...
Well, it was...
what was that book called that he wrote? Industrial...
It was Markets and the Historians, right? It's one of his best essays is on how history really influences our thinking.
Yes.
And it's not just philosophy. Right. And so people's view of all of that stuff. And that's what a lot is contained in here. Lots of great revisionism on the Industrial Revolution. Lots of great revisionism on war, for example. Lots of details about the evils of communism, of course. I mean, some of the stuff that Trotsky said is just really quite amazing in this context. And of course, you and I could probably go on for another 45 minutes about this. But we've just given the readers, the listeners, a taste, I think, of just 3 of the topics really that are covered in this. And this isn't a long book either. If you just want a nice introduction to political thought with a leaning toward the good guys being the free market people, this book is a great place to start. And the fact that it is lectures, right, means that it's worded in such a way that it's meant for regular people to consume. This is not a dense academic book, but it's about 240 pages, it looks like, 250 pages. So not huge. But also, if you're interested in his sources, there's hundreds of footnotes that I've inserted in here as well with some basic context when necessary. So check it out. You can get this for free online in PDF, right, at Mises.org, MISES.org. You can buy it on Amazon. It's called The Struggle for Liberty, A Libertarian History of Political Thought. And these are lectures by Ralph Raico. So check it out if you get a chance, if you're interested in this topic. Thank you, Joseph, for joining me today. For you all out there, we'll be back next time with more on Radio Rothbard, and we'll see you next time.